I then started looking at policies on architecture that existed in other parts of the world. And lo and behold, it was where you might expect these policies to exist, places that produced extraordinarily good cities, good design, well-designed buildings. So the Finns have a very coherent policy on architecture. The Dutch have been operating with a policy on architecture for years and years. This particular one was an interesting one because it moved away from kind of generalised claims and bids and focused on 9 key projects for that 3-year period and said, we're going to deal with these 9 projects and we're going to do them as well as we possibly can. These are going to be exemplars. And because it was a policy in place, the question was raised in Parliament every year, how are these projects going? Let's hear the report on them. So those government departments were answerable to Parliament. There is in Europe a European Forum on Architectural Policy, which meets regularly and discusses these issues. And again, they produce some quite useful documentation. One of the most recent examples of a country producing a policy on architecture is Scotland. And in many respects, this little unit called Architecture and Design Scotland grew out of CABE. It's kind of a mini, leaner version. But it's in place because the then Minister for Heritage in Scotland posed the question, where is the heritage for tomorrow? Where are we building it? It's simply not happening. What are we going to be proud of? So it's a similar question to that posed by Blair. What is the legacy? And out of it, the Scottish Parliament developed a policy, and Architecture and Design Scotland has the responsibility for ensuring its enactment through setting in place a number of processes. I looked all around Australia to see what existed, and very little does in terms of policy. But in New South Wales, and some of you may be familiar with this, there is a state environmental planning policy, SEP 65, which deals with apartment building and quality of design. And it came about again through a parliamentarian. Again, it's the issue of leadership from the top. It was the then Premier Bob Carr driving through his electorate and seeing a set of new apartment blocks going up which he deemed to be virtually uninhabitable. They had massive areas of glass facing west, unprotected. They had windows facing one another 2 metres apart. You could hear everything from one apartment to the next. They had no natural ventilation. They were shockers. So he established a forum, which, as you can see, brought together an awful lot of people working in the field, and out of it came this proposal to develop this planning policy. And it does a number of interesting things. One, it mandates the use of architects for any apartments over 4 in number or over 2 stories in height. It mandates a number of performance standards which relate to access to sunlight directly into living rooms for a certain number of hours a day, cross-ventilation and a minimal level of acoustic separation between apartments. It also puts in place a process for local authority design reviews so that when these proposals are presented for development approval, they do go through a peer review process. This is the SEP that came out, again, downloadable. A residential flat design code was produced, which brought together a number of existing design guidelines into a very coherent document that talks about all the kinds of issues you might expect to see in such a guide. And after a few years, probably not enough years, it has to be said, in operation, they produced this little document which talks about the impact that it's had and some of the virtues of the SEP. Much of it relates to energy saving issues, but there are many, many other aspects of the SEP 65 which have worked well. We recently in Melbourne brought down 3 of the key proponents of SEP 65 to run a workshop with our Department of Planning and Community Development, and the intent is to incorporate many of the ambitions of SEP 65 in the broader policy on architecture and the built environment that we're producing. I thought it might be worth running through quickly some of the strategies that we developed in Western Australia, because they came out of much of that research that was done on cave and all those other constituencies around the world, and also because a number of these concerns are proving to be common across all the government architects' offices in Australia. When the office first began in Western Australia, architects were being selected on the basis of how low their fees were. And the argument we made was that that's a very good guarantee to get bad buildings. You will not get a complete service if you're not paying a complete fee. So we put in place a process where we emphasised design as the means of selecting architects, and we established a two-staged process that had architects, once they'd been shortlisted through an EOI, to prepare, and they were paid for it, a design approach. We did not want to design. We gave them 2 weeks and asked them to talk about how they would approach the design should they be successful in winning the project. We then agreed that they should be paid appropriate fees. We took fees out of the equation entirely in selecting architects for different projects. In many instances, we actually nominated the fee after talking with the Institute of Architects and establishing what would be a fair fee. Not a high fee, just a fair fee. We put in place also a process of design reviews where we did bring in some peers and ensured that work was put through a process of scrutiny, that it was developed through thoughtful consideration through more than just a single design head. I don't know how much I can extemporise here, but it's worth making reference to the old system that was used in Barcelona, which, as many of you will acknowledge, is a city that has produced some very high quality architecture and urban design over a considerably long period of time. For a while there, they can't do it now because it falls outside European Union requirements, but for a while the College of Architecture actually had the government agree that they would pay an additional fee for government work in recognition of the importance of that work. And that money, as a fee, would be paid into the college, which they would hold in trust. And in return, what they would do was to establish a process of peer reviews as the designs developed, to make sure that it had the broadest scrutiny possible within the profession. And as a result, I think the outcome is obvious. We have a city to which everyone refers as a city of design excellence. Sadly, that process had to be terminated because of the requirements of the European Union. Where am I? Many of the people in the department where I was working as government architect, the Department of Housing and Works, talked about the usual suspects, and they were the usual large firms that won all the big projects for government work. So we decided that we needed to establish an emerging architects panel and try and direct, in the first instance, smaller scale work to them, demonstrate their capacity, and then get them involved in larger scale work. We also put in place a process where we went out with expressions of interest, seeking associations between some of those larger firms and smaller design-based practices. But that's a very fraught process, and you'll often find that there's a degree of exploitation one way or another. So we thought it better in the end to establish this panel for emerging architects, and we established an award for them so that, again, they were recognised for their work.